Good. Excellent. I'm delighted to be welcoming back Dagmawi Woubshet, who was with us a couple of years ago in Malta. I mentioned that to a few people. He delivered a wonderful seminar there, and it seems he's batting 1,000 from what I hear in relation to the current seminar. It's also a beautiful undertaking. Dagmawi is not that well known to our community, since he's coming here for a second time. So let me mention, for those who haven't experienced his teaching and his presentations, that he's published widely in African American, LGBTQIA, and African studies. He has several projects underway, and I won't try to go into those in detail. I think we're going to hear a little something of one of them tonight. But among those projects, there's a book he describes as containing lyrical essays, and I have to say I'm particularly eager to see that, because Dag has a beautifully creative spirit, and it will be nice to see that come forward and in his I should say strongly in his writings, because it's always there. Yes, it's I like very much the way in everything he does in our efforts with regard to Black thought. He's always coming back to the arts, and has a very sensitive eye and ear in that domain. I won't add more praise. All I'd have to do is read off his CV a little bit, and that would be sufficient, but I won't do that now. I'll just pass the floor to him, and thank him very warmly for being with us.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, Chris, for the introduction and warm welcome. Also want to take this occasion to thank Nemanja, Katerina, Tamara, the EGS faculty and staff, and also special shout out to the students of Black Aliveness and the Afterlife of Slavery, which is the seminar that I'm teaching this week, or now. My sense of time is a bit disoriented, but we've had such really wonderful discussion. So I'm really grateful for just how fully present you've been, and the kind of incisive comments that you've been making. So, and you'll see some of the stuff that I'll be talking about today is in keeping with what we've been thinking about in class. Okay, so I'm giving you, trying to finish up a project on James Baldwin's late works and late style. This is a project I've been working on for a while now, and it's finally, I'm beginning to see the end of it. And in fact, when we were in Malta, I got a chance to present one of the chapters from the book, and now I'm presenting another chapter. It's the last chapter of the book on James Baldwin's last completed play, completed just months before he died, and it's called The Welcome Table, and it's a play. Right, and then we finally have access to it because his papers are at the Schomburg Center in New York City. Right, so I'm going to give you, for the first stab, maybe just a kind of gist of some of the things I'm thinking about vis-a-vis late style, and what's unique about Baldwin's latter corpus. And then I'll transition to talk about, in a kind of clipped fashion, a discussion of the Welcome Table, and hopefully generate some ideas that I could use, right, to fuel the completion of this project. Okay, and thank you all for taking the time. I should just wear my manners. I should have started by saying that. Thank you all for being here, including those of you on Zoom. All right. James Baldwin has come back from the dead with full force in our era of Black Lives Matter. He has become the most cited literary artist, living or dead, on matters of race, on social media since the Ferguson uprising in 2014, his words deployed to expose white power and innocence and to express the prerogatives of Black aliveness and discontent. Decades after his death, that his words ring loud and true today is not only a testament to his genius, but alas, also an indictment of an American republic that continues to harm Black people with impunity, a country in which white supremacy still reigns king, from the former and possibly future White House to the halls of Congress to the Supreme Court, to many a police precinct where white lawlessness is the law. The renewed public interest in Baldwin has centered on the author's civil rights era writings, so 60s in the main. However, and particularly on his role as a public intellectual rather than his vocation as a literary artist, be they tweets and placards bearing his aphorisms, or even contemporary classics that take up his life in a substantive way, including Raoul Peck's 2016 Oscar-nominated documentary film, I'm Not Your Negro. These texts, they repeatedly foreground Baldwin of the 1960s. So even as this revival champions James Baldwin for our times, in its emphasis on the author ad mid-career, it eclipses the body of work he produced from the mid-1970s until his death in 1987. In many ways, the iconic picture of Baldwin today, albeit celebratory, right, even though it champions him, it extends and perpetuates the narrative of declension that dogged his literary reputation in the last decade of his life and posthumously. That narrative claimed that Baldwin started out strong in his early fiction and essays in the 1950s, notably his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, first book of essays, Notes of a Native Son, peaked in the 1960s with the publication of Another Country and The Fire Next Time, then lost the qualities that distinguished his early art. Such a narrow framing of Baldwin's focusing exclusively on the author's early to middle career, overlooking his late writings, or lumping them together in ways that confound any close reader, needs redress, as does our selective exclusive preoccupation with Baldwin, the civil rights activist. So the aim in this book that I'm working on, I'm finishing, is to fully steer our attention towards the author's neglected latter writings, to help illuminate notable thematic shifts and formal innovations in Baldwin's approach to the novel and the personal essay, and also to cast light on new genres like poetry and children's literature the author experimented with in the last decade of his life that have a profound bearing on his late aesthetics. Indeed, a distinct late style emerges when we read collectively works such as Baldwin's children's book, Little Man, A Story of Childhood from 1976, his final novel, to me, a gem, Just Above My Head from 1979, the film I Heard It Through the Grapevine, 1982, book of poems, Jimmy's Blues, 1984, and the last set of major essays, Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, 1985, and To Crush a Serpent, 1987, both published in Playboy, and Perspectives, Angles on African Art, 1987, and the unstaged, I should say, play, The Welcome Table, 1987, completed just months before his death. In these set of texts, there is a marked turn towards Black interior and intra-racial life, an aesthetic imperative to recast a Black world unencumbered by the white-Black racial antagonism that preoccupied much of Baldwin's earlier writings. A decided turn towards intramural Black life opens up new and notable creative possibilities, licensing Baldwin, one, to place queer sexuality at the center of his personal essay and Black women at the heart of his fiction. I'll pause here just as a side note to say, Baldwin is lauded for transforming the personal essay, right? Now, queer content has been a mainstay of Baldwin's work as early as that classic of queer fiction, Giovanni's Room from 1955. But Baldwin, even though his personages are deeply personal, he never imploded his own queer coming of age till the 1980s, right? Which is a notable shift for someone who used his own personal story as text for collective, and his own vulnerability as text for collective reflection, right? So that. Two, to reimagine the terms of kinship between Africans and African Americans is a different preoccupation about diaspora matters, because Baldwin's such an American author. His themes are about the American experiment, but there's a turn more expansively to think about Africa and its diaspora. And third, to innovate a literary gaze that begins to see the Black body anew and to adopt a retrospective regard that constitutes the author's body of work. And I'll be touching on these, the third feature. These features of Baldwin's latter writings coalesce into a distinct late style that refuses to be summed up by a myopic declension paradigm or the aesthetics and politics of the civil rights movement, where still too often, we find Baldwin stuck. Now, I'm not the only one interested in Baldwin's late work. This is something that we see recently. I want to be generous here. Magdalena Zabrowska, Me and My House, James Baldwin's Last Decade in France, Eddie Glaude's Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Now, James Baldwin in the 80s, Witnessing the Reagan Era, and a book I adore, Ed Pavlik's Who Can Afford to Improvise, James Baldwin and Black Music, The Lyric and the Listener, all publications in recent years, in the last decade, 5 to 7 years, and also the founding of a James Baldwin review in 2015. So there is a renewed interest in James Baldwin studies to actually reanimate and think anew, right? This latter corpus. But still, that said, the declension paradigm or a narrow civil rights point of view still reigns. Now, Baldwin's corpus manifests the major transformations in 20th century Black literature and thought, and presciently it defines the aesthetics of our contemporary era. Recall that Baldwin's first published piece appeared in 1948 and his last in 1987, right? Big span. During this pivotal interval, he bore witness to a series of world historical changes, from the civil rights, Black power, women's and gay liberation movements in the United States, to decolonization and independence movements across the global South, as well as a remarkable shift in Black arts and letters. For instance, the category, the Negro writer, which white critics from Leslie Fielder to Irving Howe in the 1950s and 60s were obsessed with and adamant in defining, that patronizing prescriptive category had been exhausted, or at the very least had become mightily suspect by the 1980s. Moreover, it was no longer the three leading male authors, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, and Baldwin, who were touted to epitomize the Negro writer at mid-century, but instead Black women authors who would become the standard bearers of African-American literature in the 1980s. So reading late Baldwin then demands that we contend with these shifts in time and in the very paradigm of the Black and the American writer, including how his work informed and was informed by Black women authors. From the mid-1970s onward, in fact, Baldwin's key interlocutors were Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Audre Lorde, the critic Eleanor Taylor, and other Black women authors whose intersectional, expansive, interior articulation of African-American life significantly revised the terms of Black arts and letters. And in his fiction too, for instance, in the book I love, his last novel from 1979, Just Above My Head, you could see the clear intertextual conversation that he strikes with Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, right? In earlier novels, Baldwin has some of the most scathing essays of Richard Wright, right? But now it's a very different kind of rapport because the times have changed, and who gets to represent, right? Who is the standard bearer of Afro-American literature? As such, Baldwin's late works participate in and reflect the changing literary and cultural landscape of the 1970s and 80s, where we find him no longer among the company of race men, be they artists like Wright and Ellison, or public figures like Dr. King and Malcolm X, but among Black women artists who are appending the terms of American literature. Looking at his work from a later vantage point then, as I'm suggesting, reorients how we read and reframe the Baldwin canon, as well as the arc of 20th century Black literature and thought, of which he is a principal architect. I'll consider Baldwin's last work, the Welcome Table, in the second half of the talk, in the latter half of the talk, but first allow me to consider two signature features of Baldwin's late style: his retrospective eye and his interior gaze. There is a retrospective regard, self-reflexive of both the author's late age and the body of work he's produced over time that comes through and through in Baldwin's latter writing. Notice, for example, how he begins the introduction to The Price of the Ticket. I was having a conversation, Price of the Ticket, right? His collection of his nonfiction writings spanning from 1948 to 1985, a collection published in 1985. He writes, "My soul looks back and wonder how I got over. Indeed, but I find it unexpectedly difficult to remember in detail how I got started," unquote. In a draft version of this introduction, which he later amended, right, which is part of in the archive, Baldwin's opening sentences are actually much more explicit in registering this new temporal horizon and this new point of view. And we go to the first slide, please. Just so you could see, also just appreciate that Baldwin's syntax. Oh yeah, the next slide. Thank you. Right. So as I said, the book begins the collection, right? My soul looks back wonder, but this is how we find the initial draft. He says, "I'm writing this from a vantage point I never expected to reach, and with a heavier heart than I might have hoped to have by now. Vantage point does not refer to wisdom. Time passes simply, and you see today what you could not have seen yesterday. And when and if tomorrow comes, you will see what you see today somewhat differently. If you don't have the good sense, as a friend puts it, to die at 59, you must become 60. The heavier heart refers to the fact that the dreams of one's youth have dictated in some way the road one followed to find oneself before mightier questions than youth can ever imagine. If after a career which spans nearly 40 years, my soul looks back and wonders how I got over." Now, he repeats the same, these are gospel lyrics. My soul looks back and wonders. Again, in his last major essay, Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, published in Playboy magazine, 1985, and generally throughout his 80s work, he marks the distance among the time of his youth, the time of the 1960s, when his role as a public intellectual was at its peak, and the time of older age and the revelation time affords, with idioms like "in retrospect" and with songs of survival and self-revelation. Here's another example. Notice again the calibration of time at the outset of I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Dick Fontana and Pat Hartley's intimate cinematic portrait of Baldwin. Here's how Baldwin articulates the film's multiple time frames. Next slide, please.
It was 1957. I left Paris for Little Rock. 1957. This is 1980. And how many years is that? Nearly a quarter of a century. And what has happened to all those people? Children I knew then. And what happened to this country? And what does this mean for the world? What does this mean for me?
Thank you.
Medgar, Malcolm.
Oh, sure, yeah, that's fine. But you see the framing. This is the very first scene of this beautiful intimate portrait of Baldwin. So this is a recurring sentiment in Baldwin's late works, a clear self-awareness of time's expansive duration, a sense of induration and survival, right? Because he has survived so many people, including friends who've been assassinated during the civil rights movement. So I'm calling it induration and survival, and a formal self-reflexiveness, an aesthetic self-reflexiveness of how late age bears on one's memory and creative enterprise, right? And here as an aside, one of the things that I'm thinking like in the introduction is engaging theorists of late style. We get that term from Theodore Adorno's essay, Beethoven's and Late Style. And Edward Said, also as he was facing his own imminent death, wrote some really beautiful essays, especially two essays, Timeliness and Lateness, and Glimpses of Late Style, that have been very helpful to me, in part because both Adorno and Said are preoccupied with the right of what Said calls, after Adorno, the right of the aesthetic, right? Like formally, what is the formal law of late style, right? So the attention on the aesthetic prerogatives of these late works. Most recently, Teju Cole also has an essay on lateness, but in all of their essays, it's so interesting. In my reading of late style, the theory is all done very suggestively. We don't have it's not a kind of systematic take on late style. To me, which shows how elusive the concept is, and also depends on a particular artist, right? Like we can't have just a generic definition. It depends on a particular artist, perhaps. So if you have suggestions of also things that you've come across around how best to theorize late style, I'll be more receptive to hear it, right? But so this retrospective regard is a major feature and something that I think through. But there's another equally noticeable gaze that also animates Baldwin's late work, a new optic of blackness that he began to experiment with in Little Man, a very little known, little studied gem in the Baldwin canon. Children's book, and the book is illustrated by his friend Yoran Kazak. Now, in the vast gallery of Baldwin's protagonists, while adolescents are plenty, young children like the protagonists of Little Man, W.T., T.J., and Blinky, ages 4, 7, and 8 respectively, are only a handful. Giving full fidelity to the interior lives and the perspectives of Black children, and experimenting with the genre of children's literature, Baldwin marshals a new literary gaze in Little Man. Notice how W.T., T.J., and Blinky describe each other and the adults near and dear to them. Next slide, please. All right. W.T. got the right name. He the color of tea after you put in the milk. Blinky, she a funny color, her color changing all the time. She always make TJ think of the color as sunlight when your eyes closed and the sun inside your eyes. When your eyes is open, she the color of real black coffee early in the morning. Her skin, and I'm going just a series of descriptions. Her skin, the color of peaches and brown sugar. Another character described as, she got a color like honey and watermelon. Wow. He about the color of chocolate cake with no icing on it, and so forth, right? Now, since children as young as the characters of Little Man have yet to fully grasp the racial norms of America, namely its white gaze, their characterization of Blackness is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Theirs is a description fueled by the imagination rather than extant racial codes, by what I call a brilliant Black chromaticism than the nation's monochromatic vocabulary. Now, Baldwin's use of such lush, sensual, and sensory imagery to characterize Black skin and the Black body, an intimate interior intramural gaze that I call Black romanticism, becomes a major feature of his late works. For we see the discovery that he makes in a minor form of children's literature apply to great effect in his magnum opus, Just Above My Head, and in his final work, the play The Welcome Table. Notice again how Baldwin describes his character's skin in his last and arguably finest novel, Just Above My Head. Next slide, please. Right? One character is described as with freckles like pricks of needles dotting his copper skin. Another character is gingerbread colored. Another, I would have called him strawberry. He had that kind of flush beneath the banana colored skin. Another, the color of ginger snaps. Yet another, color glowed like peanut butter and honey. All of a sudden I'm getting hungry. Or in the welcome table, the same kind of descriptive imagery, right? Skin like rich chocolate candy, or the color of gingerbread, and so on and so forth. Like Little Man, in other words, Just Above My Head, a major text, and the welcome table, I think once it's staged, will become a major text of his in the Baldwin canon, furnish a rich gallery of Blackness, an impressive Black romanticism that sees the Black body anew. Now, why is this significant? The gaze, the white gaze, organizes so much of the modern discourse of race. Right? This is something actually in our class we've been talking about, we're talking about today. From the Enlightenment to the present, it underpins the elaborate, needless to add, wildly fabricated and deeply inimical racial discourse that's coalesced around Black body, Black epidermis. This is why different generations of Black writers of the 20th century, and indeed touchstone works in the field of Black studies, have focused on and theorized the instrumentalization of the white gaze. For instance, in his foundational work of Black studies, The Souls of Black Folk from 1903, W. Du Bois identifies the gaze as a principal mechanism of white power, an apparatus by which a person is transformed into possession, being reduced to problem. At the very outset of his book, Du Bois recalls what made him aware of his racial difference for the first time in his life was a rejection unveiled by a mere glance. He writes, next slide, please. I was a little thing away in the hills of New England, where the dark Housatonic winds between Hoosac and Taganik to the sea. In a wee wooden schoolhouse, something put it into the boys' and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, in exchange. The exchange was merry till one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card, refused it peremptorily with a glance. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. What's most remarkable here in this passage is not the novelty of the anecdote, neither the sour exchange between a Black boy and a white girl, nor a Black boy's dawning sense of his otherness, but the precision with which Du Bois characterizes the power reinforcing the glance, one designed to cower the recipient of the look into submission, an imperious look closed off to plain entreaty or formal challenge. It's immediately following this anecdote that Du Bois famously characterizes the internalized effects and psychic toll of the white gaze on Black people as, quote, a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Du Bois's insight is elaborated further half-century later in Frantz Fanon's classic work, Black Skin, Black Mask. No, Black Skin, White Mask, yes. Fanon begins the chapter, The Lived Experience of the Black Man, much like Du Bois, using a personal anecdote as a conduit to theorize white interpolation. He says, next quote, please. I'm going to skip the epithet as you'll see it. I left it there. Dirty N-word, or simply look a Negro. Much has been written about this passage, by the way, right? About interpolation. I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. My soul desires to be at the origin of the world, and here I am an object among other objects. Locked in this suffocating reification, I appeal to the other, so that his liberating gaze, gliding over my body, suddenly smoothed of rough edges, would give me back the lightness of being I thought I had lost, and taking me out of the world, put me back into the world. But just as I get to the other slope, I stumble, and the other fixes me with his gaze, his gestures and attitude, the same way you fix a preparation with a die. Now, the personal anecdote here is not that remarkable either. For Black people in white-dominated worlds, over the generations have encountered that nasty epithet in one form or another. What's striking, however, is Fanon's incisive description of the power that lies behind the look, as if it were a speaking tongue, able to cut deep like a racial slur. The white gaze is a look that turns Black being into a thing, and furthermore seeks to reify internally in the Black person that imposed sense of objectification, a regard that strips Black people human embodiment and makes color our only indelible proxy. In our own era, the late Toni Morrison have observed how white power prospers asymmetrically, insidiously, by having Black people believe as if, quote, our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze. Indeed, beginning with her first novel, The Bluest Eye, a devastating allegory about the white gaze, Morrison has produced an incomparable body of work that sees otherwise. As she says, quote, the first thing I had to do was to eliminate the white gaze, unquote. Right? So I can name an endless series of examples, but for now, the words of these three giants of Black letters will suffice in underscoring how a preoccupation with and interrogation of the white gaze is a through line in Black literature and critical thought. Light, cornea, pupil, iris, lens, retina, optic nerve, tears, all essential to clear sight. But our visual perception is also governed by our disparate personal and cultural experiences. And moreover, it takes a critical eye to undo what power obscures. I'm belaboring the point about the tyranny of the white gaze because not only has it menaced our lives, it's also warped modernity's sight and its vast visual record. From the Costa paintings of colonial Mexico, to American minstrel shows, to passbook mugshots in apartheid South Africa, on and on and on, in white eyes, Black people have been rendered mainly through, quote, the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, unquote, to borrow the poet Natasha Trethewey's acute characterization. So at bare minimum, the onus of Black writers has entailed doing away with a cruel and blinkered vision that either tarnishes the Black body or erases it from view altogether. The eye is a marvel, aperture of astonishment, and yet without lifting a hand, much like the tongue, it's a body part we deploy to injure the other, each other. We've turned such a marvelous organ towards inimical ends. And we know, as socially disesteemed people of one kind or another, how the modern world has weaponized its tyrannical gaze. So let's come back to Baldwin. The significance of Baldwin's intervention in Little Man, that is to undo and redo how we see the Black body, is major indeed, right? And for it opens up an expansive way of seeing and describing Blackness without the white gaze, without having it, quote, thrown against a sharp white background, unquote, as to borrow Zora Hurston's words. And as I should say, in previous Baldwin texts, you know, his characters are just described as Black. So you don't have this very descriptive, lush imagery that we get in Little Man in 1976 and onward in the rest of, in the latter corpus, right? But reflecting on the uniqueness of Little Man, and here, Hortense Spillers, and here she's talking about Baldwin's use of African-American English. You can hear it from the description, vernacular, which is actually quite rare for Baldwin, right? She says, perhaps my very, quote, my very inability to situate Little Man in the Baldwinian canon is itself testimony to Baldwin's capaciousness. or said another way, suggestive of our need to locate a wider repertoire of apposite critical terms that would capture this apparently anomalous instance, unquote. I bring up here Baldwin's retrospective eye and a decidedly Black gaze to underscore the new personal historical vantage point he assumes in the last decade of his life and the new literary techniques he adopts as part of his late aesthetics. Also, to index how we may think of minor forms in the Baldwin canon, like children's literature or poetry, or dramatic literature as a major feature of late style, right? So this is one of the arguments I make is minor as major, like in terms of thinking about late style. Because it's interesting, even now, I'm not going to read it, but I brought a book that just came out, a brilliant book by Hilton Als from 2013. He curated a show, and Hilton Als is one of the he's some of you may know him, a writer for the New Yorker, a major American critic, and one of the best interlocutors of Baldwin's early writing. But he has a way of just dismissing the late works, right? And what I see is I think there's an expectation. People who are trapped by the kind of declension narrative or who kind of elevate and prize Baldwin's early work, when they look at the late works, they want to see Giovanni's Room again. They want to see the novel. And there's a way of excluding these minor forms. And the argument is actually, in order to appreciate Baldwin's late aesthetics, we have to be attuned to these minor forms that don't get, right, a proper hearing, a proper critical investigation. Okay. Part two, let me turn to the welcome table. How are we doing with time? Okay. In July 1987, 4 months before his death, from his house in Saint-Paul-de-Vence in the south of France, Baldwin sent his friend, the dramaturg Walter Dallas, the final copy of the Welcome Table, a play he'd been writing for over a decade. In an evocative letter enclosed with the manuscript, Baldwin tells Dallas, next slide, please. He says, well, I'm convalescent. This is infinitely preferable, obviously, to not being convalescent. But there is not much else to be said for it. Well, everything is new and old and frightening. One's body refuses to be taken for granted. This is a great shock, and with the body's stubborn recalcitrance, a new sense of reality begins. It is difficult to describe this, and this sense must vary incredibly from one person to another. The key, I suppose, at bottom, is one's reaction to one's life, whether it strikes one finally as a matter of regret or a matter of rejoicing. For it is certain that the time which stretches behind you is longer than the time which stretches before you. Well, I certainly fucked up often enough, and my hopes seemed frequently to turn to ashes and poison. But I don't think I have any real regrets. It's awful, not to say awkward, that it takes so long to learn so little, but there's nothing that anyone could do about that. So I don't feel no ways tired. Even his letters are so eloquent, right? Right. But again, you see the same theme of time, grappling with time, even in a missive. Not only do Baldwin's words so eloquently convey a time when the author's health was waning, but also, and more broadly, they evoke a new sense of reality accompanying the author's late age, a new disposition towards time, which takes on an acute retrospective significance. The collaboration between Baldwin and Walter Dallas started in earnest in 1981, the year Dallas directed the Baltimore Center Stage Theater revival of The Amen Corner, Baldwin's first play written in 1954, but first performed a decade later in 1965. Baldwin went to see, in 1981, Baldwin went to see the Center Stage production of The Amen Corner several times. He must have liked it because he told Dallas that, quote, he was working on a new play and asked him to direct it. This is Dallas, in Dallas's archives. In the ensuing 6 years, the two would meet on several occasions to work on the welcome table, including in 1986, when Dallas organized an informal reading of the play with amateur and professional actors in his home in Philadelphia, for which there's a beautiful video VHS recording. And later that same year, Dallas traveled to Saint Paul de Vence, as he says, quote, to experience the village and Baldwin's house in which the play is set, unquote. We learn from Baldwin's papers that he'd been in conversation with the royal court in London and Laurent Point in Paris as possible theaters to stage this play, but death with its own untimely calendar came too soon, preventing him from seeing his final work fully realized on the stage. Dallas directed a workshop production of the play at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia in 1990, right, like a stage reading. Also another stage reading at Lincoln Center in New York in 1995, although a full production of the welcome table has yet to be. Right? Given the extraordinary interest today in Baldwin's work and life, and also now that the unpublished manuscript has become publicly available, acquired recently by Houghton Library at Harvard and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library in New York, we can be hopeful that the welcome table will soon receive its due full production. Right? But in the meantime, we can cast our critical eye on the manuscript Baldwin left us behind. From the manuscript's first page, very first page, which identifies the cast of characters and includes a brief note about them, we can appreciate the direction, the slant of the play. Next slide, please. It's hard to see, but I'll read it. The characters are Edith, actress, singer, star. Think of just heed the descriptions. Edith, actress, singer, star, Creole from New Orleans. Laverne, her cousin. Regina, Edith's oldest friend, recently widowed. Rob, Edith's protege and lover. Mark, Rob's lover. Mademoiselle Lafarge, a French woman exiled from Algeria. Mohammed, Algerian gardener. Angelina, cook and housekeeper. Danielle, ex-revolutionary, Black fledgling playwright. Peter Davis, Black American journalist. Terry, photographer, and a bellboy. And on the first page, there's a note which reads, Regina, Mark, and Rob are in appearance and legally white. And so though with something of a difference is Mademoiselle Lafarge. Terry is male or female, Black or white. We can glean from this list alone the way the names of the characters are qualified to mark their gender, racial, sexual, regional, national, professional, and political identities, as well as their marital status and familial and love relationships, how the play might venture to explore the close implication of this vast web of identifications. We can see, for instance, that race matters are figured in a complex way with a multiracial cast of characters. It's not just simply white-black antagonism, right? We have white, Black, Arab, and with different types of Black and white characters. White American, Angelina is Italian, we have French, a so-called Pied Noir, we have Creole, we have Black American, right? Indeed, the playwright's note provides an arresting statement about race and gender, right? Comparing Regina, Mark, and Rob against Mademoiselle Lafarge, Baldwin articulates from the outset the very constructedness of whiteness, contingent on the faculty of sight and the oversight of law. As American characters, their whiteness is a manifestation of a particular national, visual, and legal regime of race, as is Mademoiselle Lafarge, an Algerian-born French national, whose place of birth and colonial history defines her whiteness. There is a similar complex indexing of Black characters as well, as Creole, right? As Black American. The same with gender, right? Like race, gender is a central thread and thematic in the play. And in fact, no other Baldwin work centers the world of women as much as the welcome table, with Edith as the play's top billing. The play dramatizes in particular the experience of women who have either outlived or outmaneuvered the institution of marriage. They never married, like Edith and Mademoiselle Lafarge, and divorcees like Laverne, thrice married and divorced, and Regina, twice married and now a single widow. And again, gleaning from the first page of the manuscript, we can anticipate nuanced articulations of queer identity and intimacy. Rob, Edith's lover, is in an openly polyamorous relationship with Mark, and the play includes the first named non-binary or trans character in Baldwin's corpus, Terry, described in the play's notes as male or female, black or white, a character who unhinges the ostensibly fixed categories of both gender and race. In a video recording of the workshop reading of the play at Dallas's house that I mentioned earlier, addressing the actors, Baldwin says this about Terry in relation to the play's larger aims. He says nothing really. So he's sitting there, and actors about to read, and he says, "Well, I don't want to say too much about the play, but I'll say this." Right? He says, "The only thing I will say about Terry is she's male or female, black or white, and it could be played either way. If it's a male, that alters the relationship to Terry, or does it? If she is me or she is white, that alters the relationship, or does it? It's a question that I want you to figure out." Does that make sense? So nothing is resolved in the play. This play is simply a question posed to all of us. How are we going to live? How are we going to live in this world with a vocabulary which is useless, right? So I love this character who seems to contravene our binary constructions of race and gender, right? And becomes a proxy of how we can possibly imagine a new idiom and a new discourse, new set of identities that are not so tethered to a binary, right? So indeed, going far, I just improvised that, but I'll say it here because I see it here. Indeed, going far beyond discrete and fixed categories of race, gender, and sexuality, Baldwin seeks out new characters and new terms that could bring new life to the intricate web of identities wrought in the welcome table. The play is set in an ancient rambling stone house in the south of France, a setting that mirrors Baldwin's home in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, where he spent the last 17 years of his life. And like Baldwin's home, the fictional setting of the welcome table also belongs to a celebrity, Edith Hemming, described as actress, singer, star. The house is her place of respite from travels and tours, relief from the limelight of the screen and the stage, her refuge from Hollywood and Broadway, where over decades she's forged an inimitable career. Her Provençal home is also a much sought after destination, as reflected by the cast of characters, for artists and journalists, lovers and relatives, revolutionaries and itinerants who come to commune with this celebrated figure, or to attend one of her legendary parties, or simply to find some measure of peace. Much of the play takes place in a large drawing room of Edith's house. I'm describing it because no one has seen but a handful of people. So bear with me with this description of the play. From early morning until, takes place in the drawing room, from early morning until midnight, gradually building over the course of the day and culminating in a festive birthday party celebration for Mademoiselle Lafarge's 93rd birthday. The play is divided into 3 acts. The first act has 4 scenes, and the latter 2 are both single scene acts. Using a series of duet scenes, the first act establishes the setting and gives us an outline of the characters, while acts 2 and 3 draw out fuller portraits. And the final 2 acts are particularly significant because of their use of a formal device drawn from film, the technique of cross-cutting. This is key formally. I'll say more about it. To show how the identities of these characters overlap and reflect and refract one character. In many ways, what he says about Terry, right? By having a trans or a non-binary character, he's also trying to come up with formal techniques that of the intercut, a technique drawn from film, and adapting it for the stage. Now, unlike Baldwin's 2 previous plays, now we know Baldwin is famed as in terms of his literary art, as a novelist and essayist, and his plays don't get that much love, but he'd written 2 plays before. But unlike these 2 previous dramatic works, The Amen Corner from 1954 and Blues for Mr. Charlie from 1964, which are plot or action-driven plays and follow a conventional dramatic structure, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, nothing really happens in the welcome table. A drawing room drama more concerned with story rather than plot. An important distinction Baldwin makes in another context. In his book of essays on film and theater, The Devil Find Works from 1976, another major work of the late period, Baldwin writes, quote, next slide, please. He says, oh, that was Terry. Okay, the next slide, please. He says, a story is impelled by the necessity to reveal. The aim of the story is revelation, which means that a story can have nothing, at least not deliberately, to hide. This also means that a story resolves nothing. The resolution of a story must occur in us with what we make of the questions with which the story leaves us. A plot, on the other hand, must come to a resolution, prove a point. A plot must answer all the question which it pretends to pose. Right? This important distinction between story and plot is quite helpful, at least to me, in understanding the framing of the welcome table, which forgoes a present-oriented or action-reaction driven or a heightening of antagonism requisite of plot. For instance, the Amen Corner dramatizes the fall of Sister Margaret Alexander from the pulpit through a series of familial antagonisms, ultimately revealing the chasm between her public life as a very sanctimonious minister of the faith and her private conduct, which belies her puritanical grandstanding. And Blues from Mr. Charlie, a play loosely based on the brutal killing of Emmett Till, dramatizes the lynching of a Black man and its resounding social, moral, and legal reverberations in a small segregated Southern town. Unlike these two previous plays, respectively driven by religious and racial conflict, The Welcome Table revels instead in a very different kind of expressiveness. There's no driving action that propels the play forward. Instead, the party itself becomes an occasion to relay and reflect on the characters, past and present relationships, without seeking to resolve them. Also an occasion to create, like a good party should, an ambiance of teases, of pregnant glances, which are never fully delivered of meaning, only of the very flux of possibilities. And it is a good party because by my count, I think like 60 something drinks are served. So in terms of, and this is something I don't get into here, I have a section that I'm working because it hasn't been staged and I don't want to commit a play to the tyranny of the page. I have a subsection where I'm imagining if I were a dramaturg, what are the things what I would do with the setting? But that liquor, what he does with liquor is key, both in terms of the movement of the party and also the julep becomes a very important theme of triangulating the histories of France because of bourbon, and the U.S. A kind of a way of marking the triangle of the North Atlantic via liquor. But I won't discuss liquor tonight, but when we can drink it afterwards later. Okay, now let me be clear. There is tension in the play, and I'm almost getting to the end. I'll be done by 3:30. 45 minutes is my timing. Now let me be clear. There is tension in the play, developed and sustained via a series of deeply introspective conversations that allow us to glimpse the characters' past traumas and troubles. So Laverne and Regina about their husbands, right? And outwitting patriarchy and marriage. Edith and Peter about the price of success. Peter is a famous journalist. Edith obviously being this luminary figure of the stage in Hollywood, the price it's taken on her as a Black woman. Daniel, Muhammad, Mademoiselle Lafarge about their exilic status, right? So the theme of exile comes out and so forth, right? And via the theatrical device of cross-cutting from one set of conversations to another and demanding the audience to keep up with this overlaying narrative strategy and its striking mirroring effect, right? So as audiences, we're always saying, oh, what's that? We have to keep up, right? With this kind of overlay, dramatic overlay. The latter strategy becomes pronounced in Act 2 and 3 with the full ensemble on stage as we shift freely from downstage where the dining room is and a sitting area and the garden are located to upstage where there's a bar with stools and a piano. And we pivot freely from one corner where 2 or 3 people are engaged in conversation to another corner, the dialogue moving freely from one set of conversation to another. Sometimes it's only a single word, right, in a conversation that's repeated again, to enable the transition, the intercut, right? Sometimes when conversation picks up where another trailed off, right? So imagine a word is said, and so if we go to the next slide, please. Hard to read, but let's see. So just to give you a taste of things, right? So in conversation, for instance, in one scene upstage, Laverne and Edith are, Laverne and Regina are having a conversation, and ran away is used, and then in another, all of a sudden, that it's put on pause, and then, oh, you said he ran away in a different set of conversation, right? Or a word. So there's these, like a conversation is picked up, but rerouted in a very different direction, right? But initially it is confusing, right? But as I said, the intercut is a key element, and I'm trying to still wrestle with theoretically, give it a little bit more substance. Next slide. Yeah, well, and next slide, please. Yeah, we can end there, but I'm getting there. Baldwin adopts, okay, here's the thing about the intercut I find so important. Baldwin adopts a form that can adequately reflect the overlapping stories of the play and the overlapping identities of work. A form, as I develop, that later becomes a signature queer theatrical device, which is the device that distinguishes Tony Kushner's much lauded play, Angels in America, right? Perhaps the most iconic queer play of the era. So Baldwin finishes in 1986. Kushner's play debuts in 1992. So I'm reading them in the same, right? In the 80s, early 90s queer moment with other plays, but the intercut, right? So while now Kushner is credited with formalizing cross-cutting as a new theatrical contrivance. But I show how the same technique has an unknown but remarkable queer antecedent in the welcome table. What's so fascinating about Baldwin's use of this technique, on the one hand, is how he appropriates a formal device so common in film for the purpose of the stage, right? Cross-cutting, so-called split screen, is a drama technique borrowed from the world of film editing, where two scenes are intercut to establish continuity, right? In drama and theater, the term is used to describe two or more scenes which are performed on stage at the same time. This makes it impossible to juxtapose scenes or snippets of scenes that happen at different times or in different places. So there's a kind of temporal element here, using separate areas of the performance space. The technique is used to highlight or contrast a particular theme or aspect of the story. Using different groupings, both scenes could happen simultaneously, or one scene put on pause while the other comes alive. This can have a similar effect to spotlighting particular areas on stage or using a split screen in film. So this transposition of formal device across genres is innovative and interesting enough. But moreover, I read this form and its uses on the stage as a particular queer form. In fact, a form that Kushner exploited to powerful effects in Angels in America, right? Kushner's essay, at the same time he was working on Angels in America, he has this beautiful essay called Notes on Political Theater, and what he calls the theater of the fabulous. I would argue that this theatrical device of gender bending, because you make male actors playing female roles, that's an old thing, but it's also a way in which you have split scenes in Kushner's play, split scenes through the play of straight couples or queer couples, and it's a way to divide, right? Or the straight couples become a way interlocutors to the queer couples, etc., right? Like it's blurring this divide that we set up among these categories of identification, right? But he calls all these split scenes, what they achieve is gender fuck. I have an elaborate thing about this. But this is what Kushner says, because it's difficult to keep up, right? He says, quote, this is in his stage notes, overlapping is fine. The proceeding may be a little confusing, but not the final result, unquote. Right? And for me, reading the manuscript of Baldwin's play, I felt the same way. Initially, I was like, what in the world is happening, right? But not in the final result. Listen to this. In a conversation with Kushner, the filmmaker, Robert Altman, who was initially slated to adapt Angels in America, Mike Nichols ends up doing it for HBO. It's a beautiful adaptation, actually. And Kushner wrote the screenplay too. Altman discusses the difficulty of adapting Angels in America for the screen. Says Altman, quote, "The problem that we face is that your play used so many cinematic antecedents. You used the technique. You had cross-cutting, people talking at the same time. You know, it's cinema. It became a new way of looking at theater. But then when we translate that back to film, is that going to be ordinary? I don't have the slightest idea of our solution is going to be a truly tone, right?" So here's a filmmaker initially who was slated to adapt film, and he's saying, well, you're already using a film device. How am I going to, right? That conundrum. Now, we know Baldwin was an avid moviegoer. So those of you who've seen I'm Not Your Negro can sense that, but also his book, The Devil Finds Work, is a beautiful text of film criticism, right? So we see how an author, especially later on, as I said, Devil Finds Work from 1976, was really interested about film, right? And different formal techniques of film as he's working on the Welcome Table, because he's been writing a draft of it for 10 years, is beginning to think formally how to adopt cinematic forms into film, right? And we see that in the formally, but I have a section when I read this play in a larger, because the 1980s, as we know, is in spite of the AIDS crisis, or because of the AIDS crisis, I should say, it is an era of queer renaissance. So many artists, right, in order to combat the AIDS crisis, are producing these extraordinary works, right? Of course, including Angels. But what we get in this new set of a new generation of queer plays is also non-binary and trans characters, right? So I think of Asato Saint's play, who also died of AIDS, New Song Love. Just to give you a sense, we have a character named Blaze. This is how he's described, or they're described, pardon me. The writer, 28 years old, Black. He wears a red robe embroidered with lizard skin, sun satellites, volcanoes, and salamanders. On one scene, he wears a Grace Jones drag. Another character, Spirit, she of the dream, the love we need, to be played by an androgynous-looking Black female dancer, right? So on and so forth. And I have a set of, this is a thing that we see of non-binary and trans characters emerging in the 1980s, but Baldwin is there, right, in 1986. We don't give him credit for. And not only that, I promise I'm almost there. His essay, The Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood, is a theoretical essay about what it means to be intersex, right? And how we all have what he says, the spiritual resources of male and female. And before we have the term before the terms that are at our disposal now, he's actually trying to come up with a vocabulary to think about non-binary sexual identity and identifications, right? Okay, let me end. Well, I'm just gonna give me 1 minute. Okay, so there's that. Now, what I end, I'm running out of time, but I end the chapter with a kind of deliberation of how the archive gives us a very different portrait of James Baldwin than the one we're accustomed to, right? As I said, he's a public intellectual, you can say he's a civil rights activist, but as a literary artist, he's known as a novelist and an essayist. But if you go through the playwright, and this really surprised me as someone who's been reading for Baldwin for a long time, actually, if you hadn't read anything by James Baldwin and you just looked at the archive, you would walk away thinking, oh, this is a playwright first and foremost, right? And why is that? Because we find so many drafts of plays, right? So many. A play called The Rehearsal, taking place from 1935 to 36. I'm particularly taken by it because it is after 1935, during the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy, and he says we should hear a part of Selassie's plea to the League of Nations. There's another play in the archives called Tomorrow Brought Us Rain, a single act play for about 45 pages. There's another one called Jonas. His classic, queer classic, Giovanni's Broom, a second novel from we have a play in 3 acts, the screenplay for it, not screenplay, to adapt it for the stage, and his final novel, Just Above My Head, a draft of a play adaptation, right? Not only that, we have different essays that have not been anthologized in these big collections of The Price of the Ticket. There's another major anthology of his essays that Toni Morrison put together. We have an essay called The Novelist as Playwright. We have an essay called On the Negro Actor, right? So on and so forth. So the archive gives us a very different sense and sensibility of this author who took play and dramatic literature very seriously. And I think one of the aims of this chapter is by carving this other portrait of James Baldwin, this is one way we could renew our idea, or we can escape the kind of declension paradigm or a myopic vision of Baldwin the literary artist. So let me stop there. And thank you for being patient and for listening to this talk. So I welcome questions.